Pues saludos
Good
a todas
morning.
y a todos.
Good morning, everybody. Participants in this seminar on democratic governance in the European Union for the post-COVID era, organized by the 25M Institute, coordinated by Pedro Chávez. Recently, we were listening to Luis Manuel López Obrador in a summit in Mexico. He was reminding everybody of the need of what can unify different Latin American countries to make them look like the European Union, of course, with the differences of Latin American countries. But he referred to the European Union, something which is, of course, easier to do from the outside than from the inside. But it is true that the rise of neoliberal governments in Latin America and also some fervence of the far right and on the continent has canceled UNASUR. And this change is being set in motion by López Obrador. He said that the best foreign policy is domestic policy, and this has had a domestic twist and is focusing on the need to have union between the different countries. Looking at the European Union is always relevant because the European Union, from its management of COVID-19, of next generation funds, have generated the feeling that it was working after a long time during which the European Union, what was the problem? It seems that after COVID-19, the European Union could be the solution, but this is not so clear. Institutional inertia of states and of this unidentified object, which is the European Union, makes us think that in the short term, we're going to go in the same neoliberal direction. There's been a parenthesis with COVID, but it seems to have some inertia. And this is what we're going to talk about. That we need the democratic governance, because governance that is derived from governability requires something which has to be participatory, but we see that it often isn't. We have a panel that is absolutely extraordinary. And after what happened in Germany, I think this is an invitation to think, to reflect. We have to think about the exit of Merkel, the departure of Merkel after decades of rule in Germany, leads to rethinking what her imprint has been and what is going to come afterwards. She leaves with a halo of efficacy, of trustworthiness. Merkel, in a complicated time, war of which the European Union was responsible as well in Syria, opened up the borders of the country. But let's not forget that even though she faced the possibility of an increase in the far right in Europe, in Germany, she outsourced the management of refugees, and she appealed to the Christian roots of Europe. Secondly, we have deeply thanked Angela Merkel. As Pablo Bustinduy was saying, we have helped her, we have thanked her a lot for this cordon sanitaire. But at the same time, if the interests of Germany led it to have pacts with Orban, they've done it. He's done it. But there's been a twist, particularly after this very arrogant position saying that there wouldn't and never be Eurobonds, has given her the possibility of coming out of the deep mistake of the European Union with austerity policies, and which since Maastricht created some sort of neo-imperialism, even though this terminology is quite old. Let's not forget that the policy of Angela Merkel, which has profoundly affected European constitutionalism, it changed the constitutions in Spain, for example, it changed Article 135, it generated a position that we could say is mafioso, for example, with regard to Greece, to meet these increases in sectors. They've benefited from the assistance of the European Union, and there was a possibility of even selling the Parthenon or selling the Greek islands with this kind of insecurity generated by this behavior. We also have to be careful to see how these next generation policies, these European fund-related policies, could repeat some idea of charity. We always reiterate the idea that solidarity is horizontal, whereas charity is vertical. These attitudes of so-called countries that benefit from certain funds, these countries tend to appeal more to charity than others. We're going to discuss in this seminar these issues with top speakers. We're going to talk about the need to understand that in a global world, we need a political reference that has to be global. In national capitalism, we had national states, but in a global capitalism, we have difficulties to be able to manage this condition of social tissue, social fabric. We've seen a bombarding of this lately, and we've seen structures that have fewer problems uniting than to defend collective interests that are always something presupposed from nation states. It's excessive, of course, to presuppose this, but we have the idea of governance. If it's democratic, it has to give back to the people this idea of participation, which disappears in democracy where everything is completely hidden. You're fired from a drone, you're fired from your job by an algorithm, you receive a digital sanction that you don't see, and you don't know what's happening to you. This is undergone with a violence that can be as effective as that of the 1930s, but you don't even identify it because it's somewhat invisible. And this is linked to one of the problems we're going to talk about, which is secretism. The European Council has to make decisions, and it's based on secrecy, as happens with ECOFIN. And it's not only a disappearance of principles of Greek democracy, of the right to be informed and to defend your own interests on the public agora, but it even leads to the possibility of not receiving any kind of information by citizens. So if you have this secrecy and also the media, which have closed up in a neoliberal approach, and the far right with fake news, this is all transferred to the political tissue. There's something that has to do with public policies. It's not acceptable, as in Spain, to have a huge increase in the price of electricity based on the argument that Europe doesn't allow you to do anything. This is also forcing us to see how energy policies that are good for Germany are perhaps bad for the other countries of the European Union, as the same as the war-based conditions of France in Africa could affect a continent which seems to be obliged to allow the military adventures that are interested for France and Germany under this umbrella of NATO, which is a corset that doesn't allow certain ideas more linked to human rights to evolve. We can also mention this European institution, which is not inside the treaties, which is the Vatican, and despite the fact that Pope Francis is there and he's more progressive, in countries like Poland or Hungary, this has been used to try and fight the human rights of LGBTI groups, for example, among others. In northern countries, now that the vaccination processes are working, they're thinking of going back to policies of fiscal, of tax austerity. These countries understand that they don't waste money, but we think they are focused on other things. This is linked to tax havens. And finally, to conclude this introduction, the results in Germany seem to imply focus on green capitalism, which is an oxymoron. We've seen that there's been an evolution of green political forces, and in some places they express positions that are totally progressive, but in others they don't. We see that in Germany, in the past, they were in favor of the bombing of Yugoslavia by NATO. And we see that even the problems with the floods in Germany is intended to be solved with green capitalism, which is this strange oxymoron. We should be profoundly worried about this. And so we're going to have a panel session on the political impact of the pandemic on the democratic governance of the European Union with top speakers, teachers of ours like Joan Subirats, people that are very relevant in terms of political reflection, democratic reflection in the European Union, like Baier, and also people who are young and have a young outlook on expressing the need to rethink Europe so that it can become a guarantor of human rights and democratic rights in a globalized world. We'll have Lucía Muñoz, which is the member of parliament of Unidas Podemos. And this will be moderated by Esther Miranda. In the afternoon, we will have a great panel session also with top speakers on the public opinion in the European Union, social Europe, and democratic legitimacy. We'll have Eugenia Rodriguez Palop, MEP, who will tell us how we have to rethink about these links and feminism as an important element facing the far right and its intentions. We will have Pablo Sanchez Centellas, who's in charge of communication of the APSU, and Philippe Pochet from the European Union Institute, AETUI, and Marga Ferre. And to finish the day, we will have another round table, a panel session on institutional reforms to achieve this governance in the European Union that can be called truly democratic, with Anne-Laure Delatte. She's a researcher at the CNRS in France and Grand Continent. I'll be there myself, and we'll have Idoia Villanueva, who is the international person in charge of Podemos. And this will be moderated by the artist of this meeting today, which is Pedro Chavez, who's working with the University, Alcalá de Henares University, and he's been intellectually and actively engaged for many years in a European Union that cannot be a totally bureaucratic logic, but has to be part of this social fabric that has to take it away from these state inertia, from this selectivity of the state, as Bob Jessop says, that allows inertias to work for certain logics and brings the state, as Marx and Engels said, to something that looks like a board of directors of global interests of a few people. And I'd like to greet you again as the director of the Instituto 25M. I'd like to thank Transform Europe and everybody who's made this seminar possible. And I'll leave you with the first roundtable on the impact of the pandemic on the governance of the European Union.
Juan Carlos, por este saludo, esta presentación. Buenos días a todos y a todas. Bienvenidas a esta primera mesa del seminario, donde abordaremos el impacto político, como decía Juan Carlos, que ha tenido la pandemia en el sistema de gobernanza de la Unión Europea, y trataremos de aportar una respuesta a la pregunta de si efectivamente nos encontramos ante una oportunidad de reformar el proyecto europeo y profundizar en su democratización y su alcance social. Para ello, contamos con la participación de 3 ponentes a quienes quiero ya saludar y agradecer su presencia en esta charla. En primer lugar, a Joan Subirats, que es catedrático de Ciencia Política, es especialista en temas de gobernanza, de gestión pública y análisis de políticas públicas. También ha trabajado sobre temas de exclusión social, problemas de innovación democrática y sociedad civil, y ha ejercido como sexto teniente de alcalde de Cultura, Educación y Ciencia en el Ayuntamiento de Barcelona entre 2019 y 2021. En segundo lugar, quiero saludar a Walter, investigador. Fue en Austria entre 1994 y 2006. Ha sido redactor del semanario austríaco Volksstimme y desde 2007 a 2020 ha sido coordinador político de la red Transform Europe. En último lugar, contamos con Lucía Muñoz, que es licenciada en Ciencias Políticas y experta en cooperación internacional. Ha trabajado como técnica de proyectos de cooperación y educación para la transformación social, y actualmente es diputada de Unidas Podemos por Baleares y además es representante de las Cortes Generales de España ante la Conferencia sobre el Futuro de Europa. Muchísimas gracias a los 3 y bienvenidos. Creo que podríamos coincidir en que tras años de crisis ininterrumpida, la Unión Europea ya mostraba los déficits de su sistema de gobernanza y la lentitud de sus mecanismos de gestión de crisis y de tomas de decisiones, algo que la pandemia no ha hecho sino evidenciar aún más, ¿no? Primero con esta sensación inicial de sorpresa y de descoordinación, y con esta tendencia inicial de cierre unilateral de fronteras e incluso retenciones por parte de algunos estados de material sanitario que iba destinado a otros estados miembros, ¿no? Una tendencia a la de mi país primero, que está también muy presente en el orden internacional. Segundo, por las negociaciones del Fondo de Reconstrucción, que es la punta de lanza de la respuesta europea a la crisis sanitaria, económica y social, que si bien se dieron en un tiempo récord, realmente hicieron muy visibles las diferentes visiones de los Estados miembros en cuanto al propio proyecto europeo, con algunos de ellos totalmente opuestos a la concesión de transferencias directas a los estados más afectados por la pandemia, sin ningún tipo de condicionalidad, mientras que otros planteaban pues, una respuesta netamente europea, mucho más ambiciosa en cuanto a la cuantía final de los fondos y sobre todo en cuanto al método, que era la mutualización de la deuda. Existe un consenso generalizado en torno a que, aunque no se llegó a...
There is a general agreement that the level of the most ambitious proposals were not achieved, but very important changes did come about, and the most important countries that were most affected by the pandemic were relatively satisfied with the result. But of course, we still have to see the results of those agreements and what states do with these funds. And we have to do that before we evaluate to what an extent the system of governance has failed and how it can be
reformed to be more democratic. In a certain sense,
degree, the Conference on the Future of Europe is the attempt of the EU to deal with this debate between the results and the legitimacy of the European institutions, which have recently been questioned by European citizens.
The first question
I want to put forward today for our guests is
how the pandemic has questioned
placed this system in question. What experience
decision-making mechanisms
we have,
what lessons we can draw, and how we can turn the situation in an opportunity to improve the democratic governance of the institutions. This is the question that I'm asking you, and that I'd like for you to answer me in less than 8 minutes in the order in which I introduced you, which is the order you have on the poster. So I'd like to give the floor to Joan. And
thank you, Esther, for this introduction that I think contextualizes the issue very well. It's difficult to answer everything that you have put forward in just 8 minutes, but I'll try to deal with it. First of all, the pandemic has become one more crisis to add to those that the European Union has had for years now. For example, the 210 debt crisis, the 2015 migration crisis, Brexit 2016, and to a certain extent, the beginning of the pandemic at the beginning of 2019, end of 2019 to beginning of 2020 showed that supranational entities were not working. The WHO wasn't working, neither was the G20, and neither were other multilateral organizations. They weren't capable of dealing with the crisis as quickly as necessary. Looking back, we could probably say now that it was not conceptualized well at the time. We've got to also bear in mind that the pandemic has actually made things worse, things that had already been studied in the past. For example, that we couldn't carry on with the high level of exportation of natural resources and growth, etc., that level of growth. There's this argument that the virus has come from an excess of animal exploitation, and this led to the jumping of the species from animals to humans, and that forms part of the whole crisis. And in this context of complexity and uncertainty, in which at the same time inequalities have continued to increase, I think that the EU has had, as you have really intimated, the EU has had a much better reaction than we might have expected, given its, what it's been doing in the past. In the past, this hasn't been the case, and the EU now has been considerably more executive. It's been more active than it was in the past. It's moved for health. Europe for Health has had a considerably important role, and Juan Carlos mentioned technology issues. I think the EU has made a quantum leap in cybersecurity. The fact that they were able, within this framework of criticism of France and Germany, were quite frugal about the development fund. Perhaps this is not what we would like, but it is an important move forward if we compare it with the attitude of the EU in the previous crisis, the debt crisis. And then also the incorporation of a European tax policy. We're now talking about a tax policy in 2024 that goes way beyond what we have seen before. So I think that we could say there's an increase in the active nature, in the executive nature of the EU, and I think it's a positive reaction. Perhaps politically it's conservative, but I think it shows there's more politicization of the European Union rather than the Eurosceptic, anti-European authoritarianism, populism. And I think the reaction of the EU has been political, not just technical. So I would like to underline the political nature of this response of the EU, because it could have been a more timid reaction, and the anti-European, racist, populist tendencies would have taken advantage of this. So now there may be an increase in proactive trends, and I think those of us who are in favor of European being much more present in political and social dynamics of the contemporary world would like to see this. So what are the doubts? Juan Carlos mentioned them. I'm not going to stress them because I don't have that much time, but the doubt is that, is this just the surface, which is, there's a new centrism, unlike what a lot of people are saying, that neoliberalism has ended. Now with the Transformation Fund and the Green Deal, Biden's Green Deal, we're in a new phase, which has put an end to the neoliberal rationale. Perhaps this is not the case. Perhaps we're talking about green growth. And this is going back to developmentism with a green trend, but not really the New Deal with Roosevelt, or with public planning, for example, the important role that the private sector is being given in the recovery. So I'm going to leave it there, but it would be interesting to talk about the new governance, democratic governance for the future. And I still got lots of doubts about this. Thank you. Walter?
Thanks for having me, and thanks for providing the possibility of speaking in English.
Por invitarme, muchísimas gracias por darme la posibilidad de expresarme ante ustedes.
Well, I would start with the question: what do the pandemic, the rise of China, and the military defeat of the West in Afghanistan have in common?
¿Qué tienen en común el ascenso de China con la derrota militar de Occidente en Afganistán?
I'm afraid I have the original language also. That means that the translation is overlapped through the original language. I wanted to say, what do these three events have in common? And I think the three of them prove that globally and also from a European perspective, we have entered in a period of transformation.
Y la pregunta es cómo se relaciona Europa con este proceso global de transformación. Y la cuestión de la democracia en Europa, por lo tanto, está interrelacionada con la cuestión de la relación entre la democracia
institucionalizada
on the European level. But before going into detail, I want to say that when talking about democracy, we should not content ourselves or confine ourselves to the liberal notion of democracy, which more or less limits democracy to everyone's individual right to express him or herself freely. Popular democracy, as epitomized by universal suffrage, which, by the way, was not won by the liberals, but by the labor movement, goes beyond this by establishing the right of the working class to articulate their collective interest. And this raises a complex problem in Europe, since independently of any possible theoretical approach, in practice, socialist parties operate within a nation-state framework, which means that they compete with other forces for state power, something which involves anyway defending democratic self-determination. And all the more as literally every social and political progress achieved in welfare and labor has been won and institutionalized nationally, which why the question cannot be whether nations are still relevant. They are simply because they objectively exist. In question is rather how the right of self-determination can be exercised under the current historical circumstances of this global transformation and upheaval. There's a strange contradiction, namely that what has to be done in terms of the pandemic to cope with the climate crisis, there is a vast agreement among the scientific communities and even among large parts of the population. What actually is lacking is the capacity of forming the political will, which is the institutional frame for implementing what are regarded as the necessary measures. And here we are talking about huge financial means. I do not want to downplay the EU Recovery Fund, but compared with the recovery package passed through the US Houses of Congress of $1,900 billion, the amount in play in Europe is in fact very little. And it's even not only about the means which are to be invested. What we have to cope with is the necessity of changing distributional relations and even changing the property order. And even this is not enough. The societies of the North, if they were ready to participate constructively in the process of global transformation, they would have not only to accept the imperative of ecology, of sanitary policies, of the introduction of a new productive model, they will simultaneously have to agree to a global redistribution of resources and life chances. And these are not minor changes in cultural and mental adjustments of the populations. In political terms, what we are actually talking about is political leadership and cultural hegemony. And how does this now relate to European integration? I think nobody can seriously believe that any single member state of the EU is fit for coping with this challenge alone. More pertinent is the question, can we trust in the problem-solving capacity of the cooperation between governments, which is the predominant model of today's EU? Has the system delivered what it promised, for example, during the pandemic? And I think it has done not. True, the providing for non-repayable transfers to the countries hit hardest by the crisis was a good move. However, the suspending of the Stability and Growth Pact in spring 2020, so positive it actually has been, does not testify for the learning ability of the system, but rather of the necessity of breaking its rules. And still, its renewed activation hangs like a sword of Damocles over the economic recovery. To start the debate about alternative models, we must oust some phantoms. The first is the United States of Europe. What should that be? Could the EU declare itself a republic and endeavor expanding to the east? Like it or not, security and peace in Europe can only be achieved in a frame which goes beyond the EU, a security architecture encompassing both member states and states like Russia. Thus, the architecture must be emancipated from the US and the NATO and must be based on pan-European framework like the Council of Europe or the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Imagine member states of the OSCE could conclude an agreement on transforming Europe into a nuclear weapon-free zone like Latin America. Would not that be a huge boost in European integration? Second phantom, European integration can only be constructed on the debris of the nation states. Why should it be so? What, for example, might be good for Norway is not necessarily applicable to Austria. The socialist left, therefore, always has recognized the principle of national self-determination. And the problem is even more complex, since the same right of self-determination for Germany or France impacts Europe differently than the one for Denmark, let alone of Slovenia or Malta. It seems somehow we are in an impasse. While a breakup of the EU would inevitably revitalize the traditional imperialist rivalries, the paralysis of its institutions would feed the national populist right. Third phantom is the account that the model of the European unification à la Monnet, Schuman, de Gasperi was meant to unite Europe. Spinelli is wrongly put into the same basket. Anyone who reads the Ventoteno Manifesto can see that what it had in mind was not merely a federalist, but a socialist Europe. In the opposite, the European coal and steel community, which placed German and French steel industry under joint administration, was coupled with the founding of NATO, primarily meant to prevent socialism. And when Spinelli, 35 years later, authored the draft for the treaty establishing the European Union, which was adopted by the European Parliament, he accepted this state of affairs of things and focused on creating a framework for a socially and politically embedded capitalism. As we know, the outcome was the Single European Act, which paved the way to the basically neoliberal treaties of Maastricht and Lisbon. In the view of history, the system of dividing the legislative competence between the Council, which is a body composed of executives, and the Parliament without the right of legislative initiative and budget prerogatives, resembles enlightened absolutism rather than a classical two-chamber system. Hence, the refoundation of Europe based on real democracy requires that the European Parliament becomes actually the center of decision-making in those affairs for which the EU has the authority or the need to have the authority, for example, the control of the European Central Bank. Let me conclude with a problem. Europe by no means is done with the so-called national question. On the contrary, with the deepening of the crisis, nationalism has become again the projection screen for social contradictions, which does not burden European integration only, but threatens also the cohesion of individual European states. One can learn from Austro-Marxism, which is my research focus, that nationalism cannot be fought by appealing only to an international class consciousness, but only with a radical democratization of national relations themselves. The complication results from that for historic reasons, the national communities are not congruent with the existing state. And this applies not only for the well-known cases, but also to new national minorities emerging from migration, such as the Turks and the Kurds in Central Europe, which are spread over several states, constituting larger population than those of smaller member states, and thus becoming targets of anti-Muslim racism. Theoretically, European integration could provide an appropriate frame for sublimating old and new national contradictions. Anyway, integration does not require only equal political rights for every individual on European soil, but also the recognition of the collective rights of peoples and nations as subject of law, which must be represented, and also in a second legislative chamber replacing the European Council and the head of state. To wind up, without doubt, Europe is in a political crisis. What is lacking is the political will and the political consensus to implement the necessary bold politics against the resistance of big capital. We therefore need pan-European social and political struggles and a strong political left capable of forming broad alliances. And secondly, we need democratic institutions on the European level, not for replacing national democracy, but for complementing them, which would allow for transforming social struggles and their demands into robust political decisions. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Walter. Lucía, tu turno.
Thank you very much, Lucía. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here in this panel session, which is so interesting with Walter and with Joan. And now regarding the political impact of the pandemic on the governance of the European Union, I would highlight several elements that have come up several times. First of all, the historic deficit of the European Union.
Secondly, the European funds and how they are being distributed asymmetrically. And thirdly, the idea of uncertainty and the future of young people in Europe. Von der Leyen, in her speech in the State of the Union, said that 2022 should be the year of young people. They should participate in all the debates about the future of Europe. Well, as a young MP, I have been able to participate in some of those debates in Strasbourg, and what I can tell you is that the system functions like a loop. You can organize as many fora as you want talking about European identity. You can sign joint declarations. You can come up with snappy phrases to sell Europe to people. But in the end, the hardcore is not changed, because governance of the European Union works through a mechanism in which the mechanism seems to lead to a system of decision-making, which promotes inequality. Obviously, there are areas that are more dynamic than others. There are citizens with very different economic situations, countries that are richer than others, and there are compensatory measures. But the problem in the governance of the EU is that it worked to 2005 as a mechanism for modernization of infrastructures and harmonization of national industries with a great cost for our country. And from 2007, the economic crisis, it was based on neoliberal criteria with very negative effects for European citizens. And now with the pandemic, it seems that the institutions can fulfill a democratic mandate of advanced societies and protect societies, offering elements, initiatives, policies when they're necessary. The seriousness of the pandemic in the end has led to these neoliberal maxims being left aside. And the idea of state intervention is no longer in question. And this is good news, of course, but we have to be very cautious, because an interventory state is not necessarily going to bring about balance. It may offer measures to people or companies that have already been benefited by the wild years of neoliberalism. And it's not a question of drawing up a list of complaints about the past, but obviously trying not to repeat the mistakes of the past. When we said that the profits were privatized and the losses were socialized, this was then. Now we can see the BCE has huge stimuli, and this has to guarantee a future for the citizens of the EU and not to maintain business as usual. And that's why it's essential for public investment to be accompanied with fiscal rebalancing and a lot of political debate. It doesn't mean that it's inefficient. It means that a democratic and political criteria in European governance is the right of citizens to decide how their future is going to be built, and not just a part of the accounts that are drawn up by a bureaucrat in Brussels. I think these are some of the points that we have to consider if we are to advance towards this balance. And this doesn't help the neoliberal Europe. I think these are minimum points, even though they're quite ambitious as well. First of all, when we talk about reinforcing the social pillar, it's not only a question of there being more investment in education and health, but also making sure that a banking concentration without control is danger for the world, is very dangerous for welfare states. Secondly, the implementation of European funds. It's already been mentioned here. Some of the problems have already been mentioned. This is a packet of necessary measures, but they may be rolled out in different ways with very different results. And in many countries, there are few companies that have the capacity to apply for the contracts. So here, I think we have to reinforce the idea that it all has to be done based on criteria of social justice and transformation of society, because otherwise this is going to be cheap money for big companies and for technological change. Then thirdly, the fiscal union. The results in Germany show there may be a change in that sense, because Germany has always been one of the most reticent countries to talk about tax. And the threat of the extreme right, the uncertainty with the future, what's going to happen with the 3% rule, all these are issues that we have to focus on to deepen democracy, democratization. And also what Walter said, reinforce the role of the European Parliament within the mechanisms of intermediation between the different European institutions. All this has to be debated. And we have to advance in the direction to try to make Europe more social and closer to its citizens. Thank you very much, Lucía. I'd like to thank you all for your contributions. It's been very interesting, partly because each of you have adopted a different approach and have looked at a different area of expertise. And I think you've given us a lot of ideas that should guide our debates on the future of the European Union. Now, I would like to put forward another question, a question to each of you. If you wish, we can carry on with the same order. Joan spoke about the results of the political impact that the pandemic has had. He said one of the results had been an increase in the executive capacity, but also politicization. This has been a conservative response faced with the threats that come from populism. And my question here would be, do you think that the increase of extreme right governments in the EU are an additional challenge for the governance or governability of the European project? And another related question, I hope you have time. Do you think that this challenge that the extreme right in Europe represents is greater because there are different voices and different interests within the European Council, and sometimes this has prevented Europe from dealing with crises in an efficient and democratic way? That would be my question for you, Joan. Thank you, Esther. Well, I think that it's quite contradictory, paradoxical. As there's been an increase in the danger of the national populist, xenophobic, extreme right in Europe, we could say that there's also been an increase in the possibilities of moving towards the horizon that Walter mentioned, which is a horizon that we all imagined, but so polarization in this trilemma of sovereignty, democracy, that is involved in the debate in Europe, globalization, democracy, and sovereignty, is moving away from the original problem. And this has led to the need the problem for me is that it's clear that the threat of the extreme right is leading to a more traditional social democratic trend, more state intervention, etc. And in the EU, I think perhaps Spinelli mentioned this, it's not traditional. In fact, I remember debates at the end of the 60s, end of the 50s, beginning of the 60s. But I could analyze, because I actually was involved in a doctoral dissertation about this. And we could see that at the beginning, there wasn't a desire, despite some exceptions, there wasn't a desire for the EU to become involved in social policies for two reasons. Firstly, because it was considered that if they entered in debates of inequality, giving rise to democratic challenges, this contradicted the idea that after the Second World War, the European states were basing their legitimacy on offering protection to save the population from risk. And this was the job of nation states. And today, social policies depend on nation states. And the EU finds it difficult to move into that field. And they only do so in the logic of the market, the defense of competition to avoid the exclusion of minorities or of women. But it's always got to do with the market. And the classical social democratic rationale considers that economic development would generate the response to inequality. If everybody was better off, then poverty would disappear because everybody would have enough money. Obviously, the second part hasn't been the case, as we all know. At the same time, what's at stake now is to know whether we're giving a leap in redistribution. The fact that on the horizon we have fiscal policy is a key element, because without tax changes, we can't advance in redistribution. And if the European Union gets involved in this will really be a sea change. Because again, this was a barrier. I'm not saying that I'm optimistic, but I'm perhaps less pessimistic than I was a while ago, than I used to be. And in this sense, the possibility or the chance that there may be, if there are enough inter-European alliances to promote a trend, and I think we have to be careful here that it's not only supra-state trend, there should be interstate, perhaps. I think it would be positive. When I read texts, also coming from Spain, the Spanish government, they insist a lot on resilience, and that worries me a little, because I think resilience is being understood as to preserve what we had after a shock, developing the capacity of material to exercise the functions that it had lost, like some metals when they become magnetized and they become magnets, and they maintain the previous structure, but they assume new functions. This isn't resilience. Resilience can be interpreted as carry on what we were doing before, but with new resources. And that concerns me a lot, because that will not lead to us being able to give a response to the criticism by the far right of technocracy, of European bureaucracy, etc. And this is the breeding ground for xenophobic populism. Thank you, Joan. I wanted to put forward another question to Walter. Walter, listening to you, I started to think about something that we've been talking about for many years. We've been in crisis for years.
You have to see whether it aspires to be a global player like China, Russia, the United States. I think the European Union is aware of that it has to have new tools for foreign policy, but that it's not making progress with enough determination, probably because there's not enough consensus regarding what tools are necessary or how to reform the European governance to achieve a foreign policy that it's at the level of the geopolitical times that we're experiencing, and also of its constitutive values. I was telling Joan something which personally generates concern to me, and it is the fact that there are different voices has blocked an answer, an efficient and a democratic answer of the European Union facing the crisis and the conflicts. So My question to you is, what is at stake for the European Union in the international order if it still focuses on itself as it has been doing? How can we change this?
Well, the problems are really very, very interrelated. First, I would like to say that the emphasis on that what is now called in the European discourse strategic autonomy is wrong-headed, because the problem of the European Union has less to do with not sufficiently developed military capacity or not sufficiently diplomatic coordination. The problems are much more material and economic. Among the 10 leading companies, electronic companies, only 2 or even 1 comes from Europe. So the problem is that the European Union would have to tackle its severe technological and ecological and economic problems, and this under the condition of a worsening ecological crisis. And to shift the emphasis of the public debate to military issues or to diplomatic issues is, simply speaking, not about that what really the problem is. Allow me a historical parallel. When Austria-Hungary at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century started to disintegrate for economic and social reasons, the option which the ruling class took was outward policies and outward aggression. And that did not save the state. On the contrary, it led it into a fatal war in which he finally was destroyed. Secondly, what concerns the human rights policies at the European borders, it is like in a camera obscura. If you say that 5 million refugees in Europe pose unsurmountable problems to the European Union, this is simply ridiculous. But the real problem is not the integration of 5 million into a community of 450 million, but the real problem is how these 450 million integrate into a world of 10 billion people, which we will be in the next 10 or 15 years. And the refugees in this sense are something like the harbingers of the necessity of a psychological, cultural, and mental change of the people. And this is hard, and this is difficult, and this provokes resistances. And that is the ideological point to which the far right connects, and which allows it to shift the emphasis from the social and economic problems to cultural and national problems. That's why I say that the left has to integrate 3 different levels of policy making into its strategy. One is to tackle the issue of social equality or inequality, which is the source of unrest, disenchantment, and protest. Second, it has to tackle the necessity of a deep cultural and psychological change, by the way, in a very radical way expressed by Pope Francis in the latest encyclical Letter Fratelli Tutti. And third, as both the overcoming of inequality and introducing a cultural change require a political consensus, we must seriously deal with the absence of a sufficient developed democracy on the European level. unless we have democracy, we will not have consensus. And unless we have consensus, we will not be able to protect liberal democracy and human rights before the onslaught of the far right.
All right, thank you very much, Walter. Lucía, yo como representante de las
Lucía, as a representative of the Spanish Parliament,
como representante de las Cortes Generales españolas ante la Comisión Europea,
in the European Commission, I wanted to ask you about this initiative.
Parece que el resultado de los debates ciudadanos que ya se están dando en el marco de la conferencia se va a recoger.
It seems that the result of the European debates in the framework of the conference are taking place, and they have said beforehand that they're not going to accept changing the treaties, and there's going to be no obligation to implement the changes and the proposals that come out of the debates. Now, do you think that these limits that the governments of the different member states have imposed beforehand can lead to a failure? And if that's not the case, how can we change the European? Is it possible to change the European Union without changing the treaties? How can we really take advantage of this opportunity and avoid it just being an academic exercise or even a whitewashing, an attempt of the EU to improve things? Well, I think that the Conference for the Future of Europe has started in a very chaotic way, and it's not very transparent. This secretism that Juan Carlos Monedero mentioned when he was presenting the seminar, I think this is very clear. If we see how the decision-making process is working for the organization of the conference, we have a situation in which we don't really know who's taking the decisions. And they don't want the results of the working groups made up of national MPs to be public. So what I see is that this whole process is an attempt to move closer to citizens on the part of the EU. As we said before, there is a crisis of legitimacy. It's a historical crisis of legitimacy, and this is one way that they are attempting to move closer, especially to younger people, and get younger people more involved in the European project. So I think it's wrong to ask people to participate when they don't even have the possibility to influence decisions. Participation makes sense if you can influence decision making. If not, why would you participate? Just to legitimize a process which in the final analysis is not really going to bring about any change. So I think we have to look at the Conference for the Future of Europe as an opportunity to give a voice to those who don't have it. Young people, for example, but also migrants, people who've been living here for 30 years and who are most excluded from the European Union. Because at the end of the day, the status quo is going to be maintained, and situations that are the pillar of the European Union are not being seen. As I said, I'm participating firsthand in this, and I think we really do have to make an effort to call the attention of the institutions and say to them, you can't say that we are not going to reform any treaties before we even have any conclusions. You have to be open to listening to the possible solutions and to bear in mind the possible changes that are going to be proposed throughout this whole participative process. Because if you don't do that, I really don't know what the sense of the whole process is. Is it just an attempt to legitimize the EU through citizens' participation? But obviously, when a citizen is asked to participate, but then that person's told that what they say is not going to have any effect, it just really doesn't make any sense. Yes, I totally agree with you, Lucía. Now we would give the floor to any questions that may have arisen in the chat. We're going to have a look in the chat and see. And in the meantime, I'm going to ask a few questions that you could perhaps answer as you wish, in the order that you wish, and if you want to answer them. A first question would be, if we want to develop the idea of how we can democratize the EU and what the main challenges are, summarizing everything that has been mentioned in this panel. So what are the main challenges and how we could democratize more? Secondly, what political and social internal alliances are necessary and possible to change the nature of the EU? And finally, and this question, I think, is actually aimed at Walter. Why does the extreme right, why are they managing to capitalize on social unrest because of neoliberal policies? And why isn't the transformative left doing as much as they could to do this, to do something about this, to contest it? I would like to talk about the first question about democratization. I think that before, I think Juan Carlos spoke about the structure between the Council, the Parliament, and the Commission. He said it was medieval and not modern. But I think during the pandemic crisis, inevitably, there's been a process of consensus, a notable consensus between the Council and the Commission, the European Central Bank, and the European Parliament, I would say, to a great extent. I'm not saying total consensus, but I think that they have kind of adapted to each other and to their different criteria. And that was a bit like what was once called the community method, which tended to make decisions taken taking into account everybody that was involved, all the different institutions. I think one of the dangers that we have right now is, and I think somebody's mentioned this, is that bearing in mind the lack of capacity of many states to implement their policies, the hegemony of the expertise and the bureaucratic expertise of the European Union is acquiring more and more power, because the member states are kind of relinquishing power to the EU. They're using alibis so that they don't have to do things that they don't particularly want to do, especially regulatory issues. They're concentrating this in the hands of the EU. And I think this requires a process of democratization in this phase, because this is going to have influence on people's lives. If you're going to be more active, and you're going to be assuming a more political role because you have new adversaries, this obliges you to seek alliances with different social sectors. So this requires more participation. Lucía said that they want to do this in a way that doesn't make sense because they're talking about participation, but then it's not clear how the citizens are going to have any real influence in the final decision. So I think that perhaps we should explore the ways to advance in the process of democratization. And I think inevitably it should be in a federal and intergovernmental way, but not a federation in the sense of a federal Europe, but rather depending on circumstances. Well, people would work together federally because that was the only way to do it. I think that would be an interesting trend, but to promote that, to encourage that, people have to see results. It's no good to say who's going to capitalize on the lack of results, and that this should not have a response from the European Union. These advances will be internal and be very limited if they don't have external support. Who wants to take the floor now? Would you like me to repeat the questions? Okay, I asked, the first question has been answered by Joan. I said, how can we democratize the EU? How to do this and what challenges we're facing? Secondly, I asked what internal political and social alliances would be necessary and possible to change the nature of the EU in this sense that we are debating. And the final question, which was particularly for Walter, but I would be interested to hear other people's views on this as well, obviously. I wanted to ask Walter why the extreme right is managing to capitalize on, or maybe you don't agree with this, but I think they're managing to capitalize on the unrest because of neoliberal policies, and the West is not doing this. The transformative left is not doing this.
Maybe it's the wrong moment to ask me this question, because we had yesterday municipal elections in the second biggest city of Austria, where the Communist Party of Austria came out as the strongest party in the municipal council after a 20-year-long fierce struggle with the far right. And what I conclude from this is, first, the transformative left ought to take care for the social and economic interest of the poor people. The left is the party of the poor people, the precarious people, the ones who get unemployed, who are under the pressure of the pandemic, who are working in incredible conditions. Second, and this is a very important lesson, at least in Central Europe, we never must make compromises with xenophobia and anti-Muslim racism. You cannot win against the far right if you include some of their discursive elements. And the third consequence, and this leads me now to the question of European integration has to do with democracy. And democracy is, of course, multifaceted. The council members in the Graz Municipal Hall, for example, give away more than a half of their high salaries being politicians. And you may say this is a sort of charity. It is in a certain way, but at the same time, it is a symbol that when you assume a responsibility, you maintain being what you have been previously, one of the ordinary people. And what has to do this now with European integration? I would call myself a skeptical pro-Europeanist. Because the problem of the European integration has to do with a double bind. One side of this double bind is that how can you seriously cope with inequality under the condition that you manage only 1.15% of the gross national product? This is, I mean, the talk about Green New Deal is wrong-headed because the central state in the United States, if I have the figures correctly in my mind, runs about 25–30% of the gross national product. This is the one side. That's why they don't deliver. And the other side is that there is no consensus about enhancing the material possibilities of, let us say, the European institution to influence social and economic reproduction. And this has to do with the interest of great capital. And again, it has to do with the strength of the far right in particular countries. Look at the Conference of Europe. I mean, to say it bluntly, we are now discussing, then the things go through the three-lateral body in which Parliament, Commission, and Council sit together. And after all, the Council will have to decide whether he reaches an agreement on a change of the treaties. And realistically, they say this is hardly impossible. And that is the problem. And to wind this up, I believe that we have to understand when talking about the far right, that it's not simply an expression of the unrest of large layers of the society. The far right expresses actually the interests and the political targets of a considerable part of the ruling class and of the elites, which why they have media access, which why they can connect themselves with cultural and ideological stereotypes, which are not so far away from the ones of neoliberalism. And in this competition between two hegemonic concepts, authoritarian nationalism versus muddling through with neoliberalism, in this double bind, Europe now is trapped. And for the left, I agree with Lucy completely that we have to use any democratic space to express ourselves. But the real challenge for the left consists, in my opinion, in creating a strategic consensus in the civil society, in the trade unions, in the political parties, that in order to change Europe, we must democratize Europe. And democratizing Europe means A, to put the authority on the European level under parliamentary control, A, and B, to do this in a way which accommodates the reality of 35 or 40 nationalities coexisting on the European soil, and which of the collective interests must be balanced towards the interests of the European Union as an entirety. And this is an intellectual exercise, but I would love seeing the left in Europe starting this debate seriously, taking European politics more seriously than it does it so far, and initiating a process of developing a democratic program of the socialist left in Europe.
Thank you, Walter. Lucía, no sé si quieres añadir alguna cosa respecto a
if you want to add anything regarding the questions that were asked. Yes? Yes. Well, to answer the issue of building alliances in order to deepen the democracy of the European Union. I think that the reflection on the idea of uncertainty and the idea of the future of Europe is also interesting to build this transforming political subject of the European Union. I think in the EU, there is a lot of young people, but also traditionally excluded social groups that look to the future with uncertainty. Uncertainty is part of their everyday life. And I think that the concept of precariousness of guys standing, of a new social class that suffers from instability in job, in labor conditions, and have low salaries, can be the link between different social sectors. It could be young people, women, migrants, but it can also be small SMEs and independent workers. When we talk about self-employed workers, when we talk about this inequality, this asymmetry in the distribution of European funds, we're also talking about the fact that in Spain, 90% of productive fabric is SMEs, and probably we need to fight for them to be able to access these funds, and so that these funds do not end up in the hands of the major companies and we don't repeat the same error. This construction of alliances cannot be only national. It has to be done on a European level, and this is an exercise that needs to be done in the European left, or by the European left, whose alliances are already built. But based on these political alliances, we have to look for alliances with social sectors that have the greatest potential and that have more probabilities of winning, because they've always been the losers of globalization. Okay, well, thank you so much. I'm going to read a comment and a question that we've received in the chat. Question is, the comment is following: all the decisions are taken in Europe and we don't even find out here. We're focusing on our small problems like the Catalonian problem. I would put inverted commas, but I think you understand what this person means. Do you have something to say about this? And now regarding the question is, this is a broad question, and we have dealt with many elements to answer it, but I'm going to read the question. Which could be the elements we could use as a reference to put order in the global chaos that the neoliberal system has led us by applying policies that have devastated nature and impoverished people? Which are these elements we could be using as reference to put some order in this chaos? So you can take the floor however you wish, in whichever order. Regarding this second question that has been made, it's a very open question. So it makes it possible for us to have some futurology and to incorporate elements of wishful thinking. But I think that the dimension of problems that we're facing, the accumulation of challenges and the intensity, the depth of these challenges requires a level of response that should be supranational, which I think we cannot avoid. In the future, I think we need Europe even more. We need a better Europe, a more democratic Europe, and the scale of the problems requires the scale of response. I think this is quite inevitable. In my opinion, the role of states in general is more problematic. I mean, the role of states in that scenario, and probably for reasons of my own historical trajectory, I would choose initiatives of new municipalism, that is of a broader nature. I don't know which would be the proper scale, but it should combine space, identity, and power to tackle problems that are difficult to provide responses from a supra-state area. There would be a combination between supra-state levels and proximity levels. In that exercise, which I'm saying is of wishful thinking, that would allow us to imagine this better quality of responses to the problems that we face. If we want to reduce the level of imagination, I would say that we need Europe more, and we need cities more. I think this is quite inevitable. Thank you very much, Joan. Lucia, Walter, would you like to add anything to
I fully agree with Joan in this. I fully, sorry, Lucia, do you?
Go ahead, Walter.
I wanted to say that I fully agree with Joan in this respect. If we are talking about, so to say, realistic or intelligent division of labor and a transparent division of labor between the different levels, we must talk about subsidiarity. And it could be easily the case that people disagree on what must be tackled better on this or on that level, but that's a democratic process that must be negotiated. And I just wanted to add one thing which I left out in my previous statement. I would not be too optimistic with regard to the return of the state. When I did my economic studies 40 years ago, we were trained in neoclassic synthesis, which basically says in times of crisis and conjunctural crisis, we do Keynesianism, and in times of growth, we do neoclassic economies. And I think that is what is in the pipeline in the States and on the European level, because there are powerful interests behind going back to austerity, behind enhancing the inequalities. How deep the changes which we require actually are, I learned last week in the General Assembly of Transform, where two studies were presented. One study was done by our Italian friend who looked into the National Recovery Funds and examined the macroeconomic effects of it. And what we basically found out was that the money which goes through the government and then into infrastructural projects actually to a large extent flows back to Germany, which provides the infrastructural investments which are financed through European money. And the other study, which was done, examined the possibilities of restructuring or transforming the German manufacturing, the car manufacturing industry. And what the people found out was that maybe a political decision to restructure this important strategic sector of German economy would be feasible, but the overall effect, again, would be devastating for the whole productive chain which supplies the German car manufacturing industry through Central and Eastern European plants. What I want to say with this is that we sometimes have simplified ideas on how interrelated things on the European level actually have become meanwhile, and how important the European level is, and how painful some of the transformative processes might be, and they only can take place under conditions of transparency and democracy. That's why I believe this is the core of the European crisis.
Lucía, ¿tienes alguna cosa que añadir?
Sí, brevemente. Yo creo que la primera pregunta no deja de reflejar de lo que hablábamos al principio, ¿no?
I think that question goes back to what we spoke about at the beginning, this perception that Europe's very far away and that nobody really knows what's going on, and it's a biased institution. And it's true that European governance it has a bit of collective schizophrenia, and we need to find some order in this. And I think the issues that have been mentioned here, the combination of a territorial level and supra-state level, are key. I had a lecturer at university who explained the different kinds of federation and gave an example of federations in which powers were shared, not well defined, and it was like a sponge cake, that kind of federation. And then there were federations in which the different powers were clearly defined, and that would be like a layer cake, and you could see clearly. And I think we should aspire to this layer cake to deal with the problems of the tension between globalization and sovereignty should be clear, and we should define different powers, because if not, this makes it accountability is much more difficult. Quite often governments the governments are attributed or are blamed for things that the EU has done and vice versa. And in Spain, the situation is even worse because we have all our different regions with all their different remits. So yeah, I think these concepts are clear too. Well, I'd like to thank all three of you. I think we've come to the end of our time. I don't think we have time for any more, but I think it's been a very exhaustive debate, and you have touched on many different topics. Thanks for your contributions. I hope we can share the opportunity again in the future to continue to debate this. The seminar continues this afternoon. There are two panels, one at 4 o'clock about social Europe and another on 5:45 about institutional reforms for governance in a fully democratic EU. So I hope to see you all there. All those of you who've been with us this morning. So that's all. Thank you very much, and have a nice day. Thank you. Thanks to everybody.
See you.